few days ago, one of my favorite YouTube channels, like Stories of Old, produced a video that was trying to set up an overarching theory of why movies today are so bad. Tom, the channel's creator, calls his theory entropic storytelling, or storytelling entropy. By and large, I like the video, but I think it fumbles the ball a bit. It's not that he's wrong in any of his minor points, it's that he's looking too narrowly. He's properly identified that there is a problem, but he's begun diagnosing the symptoms of that problem instead of diagnosing the problem itself. His theory of entropy suggests that stories are falling apart, becoming chaotic, hence entropic, rather than building up or ordering the worlds they create. What I'm going to do is briefly go through his points of evidence in order to show that no single one of them is enough to lead to his diagnosis, nor evidence of entropy. Rather, the problem lies deeper in our cultural milieu. It seems to me that our movies are a product of our culture. I will then show how his solutions, ways to create what he calls anti-entropic storytelling, which, honestly, if it's entropic storytelling, the other one should just be storytelling. Regardless, his solutions are not feasible because they do not get down to the foundation of what a story is in the first place. His solutions are band-aids on a compound fracture. I will then give a broader diagnosis, which is this. We aren't suffering from entropy, but atrophy. Our movies suck not because storytelling is becoming entropic, but because our imaginations have atrophied and we don't know what a story is. But before I get to my opinion of atrophy, Tom's first point is that our movies have become hollow. He references Star Wars and hints at the big bad evil guy in the realm of movies today, the MCU. He talks about the Marvelification or the Marvelization or some such evil effects that Marvel has on movies and has had on overall storytelling. In short, movies have hollowed out their depth of their metaphors through endless repetition because everyone's following the example of Marvel. He uses the lightsaber as an example. He's not wrong, but again, he does not go deep enough. He's only at the surface, hence band-aids on a compound fracture. He mentions that the lightsaber is a meaningful object. It is similar to what a recent video by another great YouTube channel, linked below, The Written Word, talks about when they talk about George Orwell's density. The lightsaber is a dense object, as in, it means a lot of things. Tom points out that we don't have these objects anymore, and he's right. But is it because we keep repeating the same thing over and over? No. It's because we don't understand what these things mean, so we use them clumsily, thereby stripping them of their dense meanings. The lightsaber is a great case study. Think of just the original Star Wars, Episode 4, A New Hope. If you just watch that movie, what does a lightsaber symbolize? The lightsaber is a sword of light, cuts through the darkness. It is elegant and precise, unlike a blaster, which is a gun of light that fires wildly into the darkness. The lightsaber is controlled and can even redirect the blaster bolt with more precision than the blaster wielder himself. If you're a keen symbologist, you will see that the lightsaber is a remix of previous archetypal magical swords, like Excalibur. Remix is another way of saying it's a repeat. It's not just another Excalibur though. It uses strategies that Kirby Ferguson lays out in his series of videos called Everything is a Remix. It's also linked below. It copies Excalibur, it transforms Excalibur, and it combines Excalibur with lasers. Because of this remixing, the lightsaber goes deeper than just being the mighty righteous sword, because honestly, lasers can be blue and red. That's not everything, but it is a major part of the transformation. Because what this does is it shows us that the sword isn't just righteous. This powerful weapon can be used for good or evil. Whenever we see one as an audience, it exudes the meaning based on whatever color it is. The lightsaber is dense with meaning by the end of the film, and this is unusual for most objects or props. Take another prop that is in almost every shot, probably more than the lightsaber is. And it's even used in an important moment. That is Luke's belt. His utility belt is just a belt, really, which is fine. The belt does not play a central role like it does in Batman or Inspector Gadget or like Tony Stark's suit. In Star Wars, the belt is not a densely meaningful object. It's just an element that adds flavor to the universe. So as we can see, not all objects in a movie need to be densely meaningful. But we do need to know, how do we make objects densely meaningful? And more importantly, how do they become hollow? The question arises, does the repetition of the lightsaber necessarily hollow out the lightsaber? Which is a very Walter Benjamin idea, by the way, for you aesthetic theory junkies out there. My answer is no. I disagree with Benjamin. The Empire Strikes Back and The Return of the Jedi continue to build on this density. Tom does mention this in his section on finding solutions, sort of prognoses. One way to avoid hollowing is to still further distill the idea, and another is to reveal that the idea exists within a larger envelope of meaning. I'm putting the cart before the horse. I will talk about those ideas in his prognoses, but hopefully you can already see kind of a strange contradiction there, or maybe a paradox, and that is they're opposite ideas. One is to reduce an object and one is to expand an object. How can both be a solution to the same problem? But we'll get to that. His video's 36 minutes long, so please have patience with me. Let me focus back on the lightsaber for a moment. The first two sequels actually do both of these things. In Empire, the lightsaber is reduced to a simple weapon, as the philosophical teachings of Yoda show that the sword is not as important as the wielder. This causes Luke to oversimplify his saber, which leads him to losing it and thinking of it as simply a tool on his tool belt. In Jedi, Luke comes back and we have the ultimate meaningful ending. Luke has remade his saber and it's green. A new color, what does that mean? This is an expansion of what the sword can be. Blue was good, red was evil. What does the green symbolize? If you're to surmise that it's a combination of the two, you'd be wrong. If you combine red and blue, you get violet or purple, which is maybe why Mace Windu had to die. Not green. So what does this mean? The lightsaber actually transcends good and evil. It hints at the third primary color, yellow. Add yellow to blue and you get green. Why does this color theory matter? Because this expands what the lightsaber represents in a meaningful way. That is the key. Meaning. The point of Star Wars is not good versus evil. It is seeing the good in the evil. This is what Luke learns throughout the films. Please check out my video on why Star Wars is so interesting and why it's so popular. I think it will help you see that so much of the story is about Luke learning to see. And his ultimate moment in Jedi, Luke uses the lightsaber to see in the dark rather than cut through the darkness. And it leads to the ultimate defeat of the evil emperor because he finds a third path, one that sees good in his father, Darth Vader. This repetition served the purpose of the stories. The condensing in Empire serves the purpose of that movie, to reveal the folly and arrogance of our recent young heroes, that they still have much to learn. The repetition in Jedi serves the overall meaning of the entire trilogy, that even the most fallen man, Vader, can find redemption if someone is able to see into that great darkness. I hear all of you fanboys whining, but what about the prequels and now the Disney abominations? This is the core of the thing that Tom misses. It's not repetition that is bad. It's repetition with no mind to the actual point of the story. Red Letter Media reveals in their viral 90-minute long review of The Phantom Menace that George Lucas himself did not understand why Star Wars was so popular. He thought it was because of coherence and the continuity of the universe, which is absurd because even in the first movie, A New Hope, the cantina scene has no coherence or continuity. The lightsaber draws blood instead of cauterizing a wound. This is why the lightsaber became hollow. It is repeated without respect to what it means, because even in the 90s, the atrophy was already setting in. Therefore, because of the mindless repetition, it becomes meaningless. By the end of all the foolish remakes, it's just a cool cutting weapon that can be easily cast aside by Luke himself. Good guys use it, bad guys use it. Peons, fools, it floats in space. Blasters overwhelm them. It's nothing anymore but a cool weapon. It has lost all the meaning that made it iconic, but not because of mere repetition, because of meaningless repetition, or in some cases, actively harmful repetition. Repetition that was meant to destroy the meaning of the object. Tom's second point is justifiably linked directly to Marvel. That is, constant meta-references that do not serve the overall narrative or the overall story. The MCU films are the first major movies to embrace the internet age. The internet is a vast network of connected and linked references. Wikipedia exists to show these connections. We used to think of movies as standalone things, and the MCU is the first major franchise to realize that you can actually gain important audience cachet by highlighting the hyperlinks. The MCU does this towards one reason only, and that is a cheap laugh to alleviate tension and to make sure no one is taking the narrative too seriously. Tom is rightly fed up with this, as am I. But again, it's not necessarily bad. Tom points this out in Deadpool, but I'd like to point out Don Quixote famously referenced a real-world plagiarist of the first book in the second book as a meta-reference, where the fictional character of Don Quixote is aware of the real-world plagiarist. Edward Manet's Luncheon on the Grass is a painting full of meta-references, which you can hear more about in my video on the beginning of modern art. Meta-references are not bad, but they are bad when they do not serve the point of the story. The reason the meta-references work in Deadpool is because they serve both the narrative and the story of Deadpool. But most other stories it doesn't. Finally, Tom uses The Lord of the Rings to try to put his finger on a sticky point: a filmmaker's love of the craft. He argues that one of the reasons Lord of the Rings is so powerful is because of the love of the makers behind it. I think he is right here, but I'm not willing to say it is impossible to make a wonderful story without love. Wendell Berry, one of my favorite thinkers, agrees with Tom on this point in his essay, The Responsibility of the Poet. I do not think that corporate interests necessarily professionalize and thereby crush the love for the craft in all of the skilled folks working on films, but more often than not, I think it does. This would not necessarily be so bad, as long as you have a director or producer at the top who actually does love the film. Tom points to the greed of the large studios as to why the love of the craft has diminished. This is probably partially correct, but remember, it was the love of the craft that built the huge studios in the first place. Also, a studio like Pixar seems to be a corporation that still loves the craft, and you can see it. Nintendo is another storytelling corporation, and they make some of the most innovative, interactive stories while maintaining a deep love of the craft. I think it's much deeper than simple corporate greed. I think it's a lack of imagination in our culture as a whole, which has seeped into our corporations, though some of them seem to have maintained a beautiful idea of what the imagination can be. The thing is as a culture, we don't believe stories are anything more than amusement. More on that later. First, I need to address my biggest issue with Tom's video. Because he misdiagnoses the core problem, his solutions are relatively toothless. Band-aids on compound fractures, like I said. He gives two categories of solution though, some for storytellers and some for audiences. I won't go into his audience solutions because they're pretty good, and even though they're kind of couched inside of an advertisement for a platform that I believe he's a part of, I don't disagree with them. They basically boil down to one true thing. As an audience member, you need to intentionally challenge yourself with deeper and more interesting stories, which takes work and it takes intentionality. He offers some ways to get started. Let's turn to his solution for storytellers. He has three. Number one, refine core ideas. Number two, change the perspective of core ideas. Number three, envelope the core idea. Basically, number one is distill the core idea of a story. Number two is look at the core idea of the story from a new perspective. And number three is expand the core idea to reveal a larger context that it exists within. These are actually just a reworking of Kirby's ideas in Everything is a Remix. Copying is kind of like distilling. Transforming is a changing of perspective. and combining is enveloping in a larger world. I agree with these in theory, but there's one problem that will arise if anyone watches his video in hopes of becoming an anti-entropic storyteller. He doesn't actually give a good definition of what a core idea is. He falls victim to the same point of view that the studio execs do. What do I mean? He uses Terminator as his example. He says the core idea of Terminator is a machine from the future travels through time to kill humanity. Then he continues with Terminator 2 to say Terminator 2 changes the perspective by twisting that core idea. Machine from the future travels through time to save humanity. He then uses the Godfather series as an example of the third practice to show that the Godfather sequels expand the envelope around the core idea of the first movie, much like how I illustrated how the Star Wars sequels do the same. So what is the problem here? Tom is not actually saying the core idea of those films. He's explaining the core plot or narrative of those films. As in, he's explaining what happens and not what it means. Yes, in Terminator, a robot from the future goes back in time to terminate humanity. But why? This is where red letter media is very helpful. They got at this when they asked folks to define a character not by what they wear or do, but by who they are. So when they ask someone, who's Han Solo? They say, a thief with a heart of gold. Who's C-3PO? He's a sidekick. He's kind of comic relief. He's got anxiety. Tom is describing Han not as a thief with a heart of gold, but as the guy who gives Luke a ride in the Millennium Falcon, befriends him, and saves his butt in the end. That is what happened, but that's not who Han is. Tom is describing what happens, but not the core of the story. It's more like he's describing the core of the narrative. I think of the distinction as narrative is a series of sequential events. A story is a series of sequential events that add up to mean something more than the sum of those parts. Terminator is about how human technological progress might ultimately be our own demise. That what we make might try to kill us. Sounds a bit close to home these days. Terminator 2 is about how human technological progress might ultimately be our own demise, but that perhaps we can harness that same power as a sort of shield so that our own technological progress might save us in the end. This is why the second is more popular in our culture today. We hope that our technology can be used wisely to save us from the foolish uses of that same technology. Why didn't we see this? Why don't our movie execs realize this? Why does Tom even miss this level of depth and good storytelling? Because Western culture has questioned the idea of meaning since Nietzsche's Death of God. We doubt whether there is an ultimate meaning to the universe, so we stop looking for meaning. Like George Lucas, we've fallen victim to other ways of judging stories. Is the world building coherent? Will this make a good line of action figures? Does this preach the right message of anti-whatever it is that's cool these days? We cannot imagine that stories can be more than the sum of their parts. Let me prove it with a case study. Because there is a recent movie that does not break any of the rules Tom listed, and yet, I would argue, it's a hollow movie with no ultimate point that leaves the audience empty and thoughtless. Which at the end of the day is the real problem. The audience leaves the theater and their mind is passive and unaffected. The movies, Tom points out, as good, leave the audience in a state of wonder, thinking, asking questions, wanting more, discussing the choices characters made. The audience is left musing about what they think it all means, and perhaps, if they're introspective, if the movie has any bearing on their own life. Movies today are amusing. Look at the etymology of the word. Awe means without. Musing, thinking. So without thinking. This is why the behemoth corporations call us content creators and content consumers. It doesn't matter to them what we watch, just that we keep mindlessly watching. They would rather leave us amused than musing, because when we're amused, we're more susceptible to their advertising measures. But now I'm getting preachy. Let's turn to the case study that defies Tom's theory. The Killer, by the great filmmaker David Fincher. Right off the bat, we can ask the questions about Tom's elements of entropic storytelling. Is it a hollow repeat of stories we have already seen before? No, it has no franchise ties and is not within a greater film universe. Does it undercut or interrupt its narrative drive every few minutes to show the audience a meta-reference? No, never in its entire runtime. Fincher doesn't stoop to those levels. Was it made with love? This is a hard thing to say. It was made for Netflix, but Fincher is one of the most demanding filmmakers in the business. With my limited research, the best I can say is maybe. Most actors who work with him go on and on about how much they hated working with him, but acknowledge that his demands brought out a better performance. This should be, in my opinion, an exemplar of what Tom calls anti-entropic storytelling. I would just call it storytelling. In fact, it even does some of the positive things that Tom mentions. But let's dive into the film a little bit closer. Spoiler alert, by the way. The basic plot we have seen before. A decorated assassin, played by Michael Fassbender, makes a mistake. His assassin colleagues must punish him, so they harm his love interest. Fassbender methodically gets revenge as he works his way from the bottom of his kill list to the top. He succeeds, and the film ends with him reclining with his love on the patio of his beachfront house in the Dominican Republic. On the one hand, you could say, actually, this is a repeat of stories we've seen before. But hopefully you know by now what I'm going to ask. What is the story, not the narrative? And that is what happens versus what it means. After all, there are 4 archetypal assassin stories that we've seen over and over again. Number 1, the talented young assassin is clumsy, but with the wise instruction of a master is able to become the best. This is the movie Wanted, it's Karate Kid, it's every origin story and every badass hero. Batman, Wolverine, etc. Number 2, the aged assassin is losing his edge. He's becoming sloppy, he doesn't care much about life now that there are no worthy challenges left to overcome. Then a young and chaotic force that was heretofore unknown shows up, and the aged assassin must learn new tricks to overcome. Every story that calls the old dog back out of his retirement. John Wick is the most recent iconic iteration of this, and each of its sequels is just a prolonging of that same story. Number 3, the assassin who doesn't know he is an assassin. He suddenly realizes he has these killer capabilities, and he struggles with the morality of his skills. How should he use them, and how did he get these skills in the first place? This is The Bourne Identity, and basically any movie where the hero has skills or powers but doesn't know where he got them from. It's Superman, John Carter, even The Matrix a little bit. Number 4, the stone cold killer meets an innocent and beautiful person, usually a woman or a child, which breaks the hard armor around his heart, and he finally has a reason for a new life. He must use his tremendous skills to protect the beatific person. This is The Mandalorian and Leon in The Professional. Even most fashion movies are some form of this. So does Fincher's The Killer fall into any of these archetypes? No. It has parts of the second one, though. Fassbender is sort of aged. He talks like he's meticulous, but then he makes a lot of mistakes. His beauty gets beat up, but he's not really out for revenge, like John Wick. He does not seem to learn much, and he's never really at risk of death. He's not a young Padawan, and he's not wondering about the proper use of his skills. In fact, he has barely any morality, and he's not awoken to the depths of life by a beatific embodiment. He already knows his girlfriend, and she's not necessarily beautiful, and we barely even get hints that he might love her or not, aside from his actions. But even then, his actions, I can't tell if he's motivated by selfishness or by care for her. If I had to say what I think the point of the story was, I think it was Fincher trying to take an expansive look at what it means to be an assassin. The first 15 minutes is a long and boring extended scene filled with voiceover narration. Fassbender explains how he must be a robot. He must be disciplined. Fincher is avoiding all the usual tropes except for the stupid mistake trope of the second archetype. Literally, a woman steps in front of the bullet. It's that cliche for a film that seems hell-bent on avoiding all assassin movie cliches. The point of the story seems to be to answer the question, what would it really look like to be this sort of assassin? The answer seems to be have over 20 fake passports, talk about being meticulous but then actually improvise all the time, kill everyone and do stupid things that would greatly compromise your hidden identity, and then kick the hornet's nest of a rich billionaire who you reveal your identity to when he doesn't actually know you even exist, and say if he comes after you, you're going to kill him. But he doesn't actually kill the billionaire in the end. So obviously, I did not enjoy this movie. But one might say, can't you take apart and deconstruct all the plot holes in any movie? No, I will not lay out what a good movie does, but only for the sake of time, because the most underrated YouTube channel of all time has already done so. Logos Made Flesh has a great analysis of Mad Max Fury Road. It's a great loss that the creator of that channel, Matthew Miller, passed away of a brain tumor a few years ago. But in gist, Mad Max Fury Road is not just about cars and explosion. It's about reconciling the relationship between men and women, when some men are monstrous rapists who disfigure women. His video is epic, and so is that movie. Go watch them. The point is, Mad Max is a story, as in all of the things that happen add up to something that means much more than each individual part. Yet, you probably had no idea that the movie was more than just a high-octane action movie. Why? Is it entropy? No, it's because of atrophy. I need to make this a little bit clearer. Let me make the distinction of narrative versus story in the way that I'm using them. And I'm not like a filmmaker or writer or storyteller, so there might be better terms for this, and I'm all ears. But these terms make sense to me. The hero's journey is this. A hero is enjoying life. Something happens because our hero has a flaw. He descends into hell along with all the world around him. He then must overcome his flaw and climb his way out of hell to end up at a higher place than where he was before. The world is restored, and often that means our hero dies because he needs to end up higher than where he started. And just so you know, heaven is higher in case you didn't realize that. But this is the basic story structure. A story is a series of events that explore how and why a person descends, and then how and why they make it back up. We can also have a story like Breaking Bad, where we see how and why a hero descends, and how and why he never makes it back up. But at its core, the story is a journey of ups and downs toward an end. Good stories move toward a meaningful end. So what is a narrative? A series of events that happen that might not seem compelling. And actually, we humans are good at making meaning out of anything. Any series of events can be read as a story, but probably a bad one. As my favorite storyteller scientist would say, it's worse than that. Let me take the story structure of Dan Harmon, writer of Community and Rick and Morty. Harmon is not a very hopeful person, and he grew up watching sitcoms. He noticed that most sitcoms fell into the Seinfeld model, that of no growth. Seinfeld famously proclaimed that it was a story about nothing, and the characters never grow, and they never recognize their faults. And, well, it worked. Why? Because the hero's journey is not much like life. Tom made a video about that. Our lives are far more cyclical, and we have to be forced to recognize our faults in order to grow. Seinfeld was a mirror, and that's why I don't blame Marvel, by the way. If anything, as far as I can tell, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and his Sherlock Holmes books are perhaps the first major culprit of our atrophying storytelling muscles, at least when it comes to the problem of serialization. Harmon notices this model and creates his narrative model, which is a circle. Community demonstrates this best. Every episode, Winger is an arrogant showboat who thinks he's independent and needs no one. He falls into some sort of place of need, his community helps him, he learns he needs them, and learns to love his community. Then the next episode starts, and he's an arrogant showboat who thinks he's independent and needs no one. Rinse, repeat. Rick and Morty does the exact same thing, except it adds in an inbuilt narrative explanation, which has become extremely popular, that of the multiverse. This is an extremely ordered model. It's not a story model, though. Entropy does not properly diagnose this problem because the model does not serve the same purpose as a story. It serves the purpose of serialization, while displaying all the recognizable sights and sounds that the audience wants. This is the model that the Hydra of the multiverse infinitely enables. Take a beloved character, transport him to a chaotic, adventurous world, let him have fun, return him back to where he was, repeat until the wallets are empty. This is not entropy, it's atrophy. It's not storytelling, it's narrative tracking. The Killer is another great example of why entropy is a weak notion for diagnosing the whole problem. It's an incredibly organized film. It lays itself out in chapters. Each chapter follows the events of the previous chapter and makes sense. It is cohesive, and yet there is no real point. Tom's anti-entropic storytelling is a call for order. Organize things so that they might build rather than fall apart. This is only sometimes true. Sometimes broad, disorganized stories can hold together. George Saunders discusses this in his amazing book, A Swim in a Pond in the Rain. In this book, Saunders looks at 7 classic Russian short stories in order to analyze how and why they are great. The first 2 address this issue of order versus chaos. The first story is called The Cart by Chekhov. Saunders uses this story to argue for the power of order and organized stories. He establishes what he calls the ruthless efficiency principle. That is, cut the fat. Only include things that add to the story, no fluff. And this is basically what Tom is sort of getting at. The second story is called The Singers by Turgenev. Saunders uses this story to argue for the power of disorder. He uses an image that the audience notices things that seem to be odd and stick out. He says that the audience has a cart of things I happen to notice. The Singers is full of odd distractions, but once you make it to the end, you realize how it all fits together, how it serves the meaning of the overall story. All of those non sequiturs add up, and you can start to see why they were there in the first place. It's like those 3D sculptures that only make sense once you walk all the way around them. The puzzle box stories that seem all chaos and no order, until the very end. What Tom is noticing is a culture that does not know how to tell stories. We make content that is meant to get attention. That is why our culture relies on spectacle-filled narratives. We repeat successful attention getters of the past. We add in recognizable patterns that break the viewer out of the narrative, but make the viewer feel like they were on an Easter egg hunt. This ultimately means we prioritize getting views, making money, and every other negative aspect of greed and narcissism. We do not tell a story. We tie together different attention-grabbing events in order to get people to watch. No wonder there's hardly any passion in doing that. We have forgotten what a story is. The point of a story is to learn and consider what you would do in a similar situation. The point of a story is not to amuse, but to move us to a place of introspection. Dialogue with our peers, perhaps. A place where we wonder, does this have any bearing on my life? Am I like Luke at all? Is there darkness and evil in my life? Can I do anything to try and save those who are held in the grasp of darkness? Entropy is not the bad guy. Atrophy is. Most viewers have probably not noticed that the lightsaber was such a dense symbol. As Malcolm Guite points out in his book Lifting the Veil, we have weak imaginations. Our imaginations have atrophied so much that in my classes, when I teach, I can blow the students' minds by simply examining the basic story of something like SpongeBob, and suddenly it changes their perspective so they're no longer just looking at the surface, but their vision can penetrate deeper. Our culture as a whole does not know how to make sense of a story because all we consume is cyclical, Dan Harmon-esque narratives. In fact, we criticize the details of stories like Snow White to no end. We think no woman should need to be saved by a man without realizing that the story is trying to get across a meaning. Jonathan Pajot gets at this quite well in his video on Snow White. Suffice to say, Snow White is meant to teach you how to avoid poison apples. Not that you need a prince to save you, little girl. Oh no, rather, if you eat a poison apple, perhaps your only hope is a prince. So learn how to avoid poison apples, unlike Snow White. We no longer understand this because our imaginations have atrophied and we are only capable of consuming narrative content and nodding our empty heads while looking for images that we like and look like us. So what should we do? Expand your imagination. Start with Saunders' book. It's not religious like most of my references. Move on to understanding archetypes. Pajot is great for that. Hopefully my videos are as well. We've forgotten that we are ultimately searching for meaning. In fact, read Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. He wrote it 9 days after getting out of Auschwitz. The entire book argues that the ones who survived the concentration camps were telling themselves meaningful stories. Stories of hope, of religious purpose, of value of family and love. The ones who had meaning could bear the worst suffering mankind has ever seen. This is what stories can do, and no episode of Seinfeld will be pondered by the next poor souls locked in a death camp. Lord of the Rings will be, though, because it's a story with the full power of human imagination down to its very depths. That's why I wanted to write this essay. Tom is right. There is something wrong with the movies and videos that we watch. We're searching for meaning, and the narratives we have at hand are hollow, narcissistic, and passionless. What should we do? Don't settle for being viewed as a content consumer. Go out into the land of stories and demand that they reveal their secrets. When they turn out hollow, show some despair that the talents of Fincher are wasted on pointless stories after he was able to make one of the most chaotic yet meaningful movies, Fight Club. Finally, read more good stories and talk about them with your friends. Why is it that Pinocchio holds your attention? What is it about? Does this mean you should stop watching Marvel? Actually, no, for 2 reasons. The core of Marvel, that is the story of Tony Stark, is deeply meaningful. Unfortunately, my essay on that one got copyright striked and taken down, and I don't really understand why, and hopefully soon I'll know this game better. Honestly, I would love Tom's advice on that, since he seems to get away with a ton of copyright footage somehow. The second reason, though, to continue watching Marvel movies occasionally is because we do need times of amusement. If we were thinking all the time, we would never be able to sleep. So let yourself relax and enjoy a mindless action film from time to time. But be sure to work out your imagination on deep, meaningful stories, or else it will atrophy again and again.